Thank you,
Thanks a lot
Claudia.
for the heads up. Geraldo, you can go.
Thanks, Claudia. Thanks for introducing us, and thanks to the Jacques Delors Institute and FGV for hosting this webinar about the EU-Mercosur agreement. So I'll start by setting the scene, right, and just discussing what has happened so far and how we got to the text we now have, and then the others can chip in on the law and policy implications of these developments. And I'm going to extensively mirror what an article that came out earlier this year in the European Foreign Affairs Review that I wrote with Alessandra Lehmann, who's a Brazilian lawyer. And so what this agreement started being negotiated, if you want to go very far back, in 1995. That's when the EU and Mercosur signed this, this protocol for an interregional association agreement. In 1999, negotiations proper started happening, so that was just an initial protocol, and there was it was a sort of start and stop situation for 20 years, as various things happening in the world meant that the agreement was never concluded. Then significant impulse was given to this in 2019 when, to I guess the surprise of many people, the two parties came out with an agreed text, which for the first time already gave let's say, the public at large an idea of what was at stake. Now, there were already discussions in Europe regarding the agreement. It is perceived to be, facilitating the entry of especially agricultural products from Mercosur countries, which are highly efficient and highly, let's say, competitive. The question then, of course, is whether this competitiveness is a fair one. That's the one that is raised. And so we saw what we saw was let's say, a union of two groups of opponents. One is agricultural interests that compete with Mercosur agreements, and that are protecting their economic welfare and maybe again the well-being of their region sometimes, because they tend to be from regions that rely a lot on agricultural production. And then on the other hand, environmentalists and people who believe, with some cause, that increasing economic activity and giving more opportunity for production and export will cause impacts on especially Brazilian forest, and especially in particular the Amazon. Now, these two different coalitions got together and opposed this initial text because, let's say, on grounds that the environmental provisions were not particularly strict, and they were not wrong. So when this agreement started being negotiated, these provisions barely existed. There were some in NAFTA, in the side agreement on environmental and labor protection, but essentially trade agreements until the early to mid 2000s were quite weak on what we now call flanking provisions, so that try to offset some of the negative impacts of the agreement itself. And 2019 sort of reflected this understanding. Although, if you go and read the chapter, and again, this is also in our article, if you look at the labor provisions, they provide quite specific obligations and requirements, and require parties to implement ILO labor conventions. So it's not that the parties couldn't know that it was possible to have specific obligations. It's that the environmental obligations were quite weak. This was again fruit of negotiations. Also in particular, there are various different, let's say, ideas and emotions that get mobilized. There's a feeling, especially among Brazilians, that this is also some Brazilians, that this amounts to sort of neo-colonial approach and let's say certainly attitudes from on some quarters, if not necessarily the obligations themselves are fine, and they are encountered in things like the EU-Canada agreement, which isn't a neo-colonial agreement. You can agree as to independent countries to have joint agreements to environmental commitments, But the discourse that developing countries need this in order to become sustainable is a source of irritation. Now, at the same time, many in the EU thought that this did not go far enough. Especially the fact that the agreement didn't include binding commitments or sanctions in this regard, especially after in 2022, the EU issued a new policy that said that its trade agreements would include environmental commitments backed by sanctions. We can go over sanctions later, but just to finish this initial stage, or setting the stage, that led to further negotiations. The EU submitted, let's say, informally, because this appeared on a website that recorded that features documents that are publicly available, a new joint interpretative instrument. Then the same website a few months later published a joint interpretative instrument issued by Mercosur, also wasn't formally released. And so negotiations took part also through the press and through our social medias in that sense. And then again, many people surprised, in 2024, 6 December, the Ursula von der Leyen traveled to Mercosur, to the Mercosur summit, and came a text that we can now look at, and that will be maybe the main topic of this topic. And let me highlight 3 things, and then I'll give the word back to our moderator. So first of all, there are 3 things that I would say. So there's a provision stating that the Paris Agreement, the Paris Agreement is an essential element of this agreement now. Now we can discuss what this means concretely later on. Second, there is an annex to the Trade and Sustainable Development chapter, which contains some more specific obligations than previously were available. But on the other hand, let's say if you want to say that I think that this is a problem, there is a provision stating that new measures that nullify commitments under the agreement, even if they are lawful, that is, even if they're defensible as legitimate measures, could allow the triggering of what is called the rebalancing mechanism. Right? So that would be a mechanism that allows the other party to require the renegotiation and the provision of further benefits, or otherwise the reduction of benefits it gives to the other party in order to respond to a measure and to restore the balance of the agreement. If we think of these agreements as contracts where the parties give some and take some, and the idea is that even if you are doing this lawfully, you should be able to you should have to pay something or accept a reduction in commitments in order to ensure that the agreement remains advantageous for both parties. Back to you, Claudia.
Thanks a lot, Geraldo. So maybe now I can give the floor to Colette after having heard from Geraldo, and I think this overall view of how these negotiations took place in practice. Maybe you can walk us through the interplay between the EU's bilateral approach through this FTA with the Mercosur and the unilateral agenda that was running in parallel that had quite a lot of impact on the negotiations. Now on to you, Colette.
Great. Thank you so much, Claudia. Thank you for the organizers of this event, and Giallo, great setting of the scene. I think it's always really important to get a bigger picture take on why we are having the more perhaps detailed discussion in one of those panels. So I think that's been really helpful. So I will take it where you left off, Geraldo, and delve perhaps a little bit more into the details. To kind of set the stage there, and then we can kind of take this as we continue the conversation. But as you mentioned, Claudia, so Geraldo has set the stage on why EU-Mercosur, why now, what some of the competing interests were, with the focus, of course, also on sustainability concerns. But exactly another element that's also really relevant in that has been the EU's shift towards adopting more autonomous measures, right? While in parallel having continued this negotiation am I audible? I heard yes. Okay, great. While in parallel continuing this negotiation of EU-Mercosur and now having a text. And one of the main provisions here has been, of course, or regulations has been the EU regulation on deforestation-free products, which has been criticized by a lot of developing countries as being almost impossible to comply with, right? So this is a regulation that is essentially a stick on trade, and through that stick tries to ensure that agricultural products covered in the scope of the EUDR, so this would be, say, wood, cocoa, coffee, rubber, palm oil, etc., that those products are not produced by engaging in new deforestation or illegally in violation of deforestation laws in a country. So that's kind of happening in parallel, and that the development of these autonomous measures, or the EUDR in this case, has been actually putting on hold some of the progress the EU has made in its FTA, in its free trade agreement negotiations, because a lot of the trading partners were saying, well, we can actually agree on additional market access and other elements through the FTA, but if you're going to have that parallel autonomous measure in place, then that will in fact erode the market access that we will have negotiated. So this has really interplayed with a lot of the agenda from the EU side on the FTA in the FTA context. What's interesting is that while that is still the case, we have a text here that the parties have agreed upon, and part of why there was an agreement was because the EU has also relented a bit here and there in terms of giving in to demands from the Mercosur countries on finding ways to connect to some of their interests as well as concerns vis-a-vis, in this case, the EUDR. So I'm going to focus a little bit on what is in there specifically on forests, as well as on forests connected to EUDR. So interestingly, it's like, let's just perhaps zoom out for a minute. So this is an annex to the TSD chapter, which has 16 pages in it. And the general take on this for people that focus on sustainability is that it's a little disappointing still, right? It could have gone a lot further. The TSD chapter is not subject to binding dispute settlements, even though there was a review that Geraldo mentioned in 2021 to ensure that TSD chapters overall in EU FTAs would be subject to binding dispute settlement. But that's not there here, which is contrasting to, for example, EU New Zealand, where they do have that, or even EU UK, the TCA. So there is that as part of the focus, but I would like to also highlight, even though some of the provisions are not subject to dispute settlements, what specific provisions there are relevant to forests, right? And what they actually have done here. And on the one hand, one could say that before EU-Mercosur, most of the TSD chapters included a reference to illegal logging. There is no international binding treaty on forests or deforestation. So unlike, for example, references to climate change, the Paris Agreement, UNFCCC, or the Convention on Biological Diversity, in the TSD chapter, there has never been a reference to an international treaty on forest specifically. So before EU-Mercosur, this was forests were mostly dealt with in the context of treating illegal timber production, which was the original way in which the EU looked at international forest protection. In EU-Mercosur, interestingly, there is a provision which requires the parties to implement measures in accordance with national laws and regulations to prevent deforestation and enhance efforts to stabilize or increase forest cover from 2030. And the party should also not weaken levels of protection afforded in their environmental law. Now that is somewhat new. We've not seen a reference to a provision like that with a direct reference to deforestation and the 2030 year, which is aligned with COP26, where the parties also looked at or made a commitment to really change its deforestation practices by 2030. So that is in a way quite interesting and potentially somewhat innovative. This provision might not, however, be all that strong, despite what it brings, because one, the language, and two, it's not really clear exactly what they mean, for example, with forest. Forest cover is not defined. Forest cover could cover lots of different things. It could cover, for example, plantations, right? So it might actually mask a country that has rapidly deforested primary forests, but has replanted lots of plantations, that might be able to comply with a situation where overall net forest cover has increased, but that's not the kind of situation that that's targeted here. So there is that question mark there, and it's in that sense rather vaguely worded. Another interesting element here is that it focuses on deforestation and forest cover. What we don't see in the TSD chapter generally is a reference to critical raw materials. That's also absent in the EUDR. The scope there does not cover deforestation related to mining. And here, the reason that's interesting to note is because I believe 30% of Brazil's critical raw materials are within the Amazon region. So this is connected to deforestation, not included in the EUDR, and there's nothing really directly relevant to mining in the TSD annex of the EU-Mercosur FTA. But at the same time, the FTA reduces restrictions on or export restrictions and the like, including on raw materials. So it is also supposed to increase access to raw materials in the EU from Mercosur countries. So you have a little bit of that imbalance there as well. And here I would also like to point out that in some of the other FTAs that the EU has recently negotiated, for example, EU Chile, I believe EU New Zealand has one as well. They have chapters on energy and critical raw materials, which has a number of provisions that seek to enhance access for EU investors, for instance, to those materials, but also have a number of more specific sustainability references to mining, which you don't see here. So that's just one element that I wanted to reference. But going back to the bilateral interaction and how that all plays out in terms of forests. So Geraldo has already mentioned they call it the rebalancing mechanism, right? Nullification and impairments, and that has a potential impact depending on how you interpret it on what this means for the adaptation of or the implementation of unilateral measures. And I'm going to leave that for Geraldo later to further explore, because I know he has done a lot of work on that. But I will just quickly highlight that there's some indirect references in the annex as well to the EUDR. It doesn't mention the EUDR, but it mentions wooded areas, and basically it talks about the fact that actions taken to fulfill the conditions in the TSD chapter will be considered favorably in the risk classification of countries under the EUDR. So the EUDR has a provision that says we're going to categorize the countries based on the risk they pose of engaging in deforestation in a way that's inconsistent with the regulation, and they look at different criteria like objective and transparent assessment of rate of deforestation, forest degradation, rate of expansion of agricultural land, production trends, and here now in this annex to the EU-Mercosur, they're saying that actions taken to fulfill the annex or the FTA under the FTA will be considered favorably in a country's risk classification of the EUDR. So it's not quite sure how much and where and how this will all be considered, and considered might not be the strongest term used, right? It can be considered and not acted upon, but it does mean that there is a bit of an open question here on how and where there could be an impact on what Mercosur countries are doing in the context of the annex vis-a-vis their risk classification under the EUDR. So that is one area where there is a little bit of connection. And then there's another interesting provision that makes reference to a commitment to recognize documentation, licensing, information and data from certification schemes and traceability and monitoring schemes used by Mercosur countries, and that shall be used by the EU to verify compliance, including in this case also EUDR compliance. So that's also very interesting, because that responds to one key concern that a lot of countries have had, as in how do you measure compliance? What data do you use? how will the EU have better access to these data than, say, the countries that are being assessed, right, in terms of their compliance? So that's a really interesting provision that has not previously been included in EU FTAs. And it also mentions that in case of conflict between EU data and the one coming from Mercosur countries, the latter should prevail. So those are some elements, and perhaps I'll just add a few more things before we then turn the discussion over. But on this, at the same time, what's really interesting is there's some due diligence reference as well. But the agreement seeks to, in parallel or very much keeping in mind this EUDR, what the TSD annex also does is it seems to provide some sort of carrots, if you will, to the Mercosur countries. If you can consider the EUDR as the stick saying you cannot come into the market unless you demonstrate compliance, then here to kind of rebalance it a bit, the agreement says, well, here are a couple of things where we're trying to address perhaps some of the concerns that have been expressed. So I've mentioned already 2 or 3 things, but other elements that are interesting is on due diligence. There is a provision to support transparent and independent assessments of traceability, etc., third-party verifications. So that could be financial or otherwise. So that might be some support required or necessary to help demonstrate compliance. And there's scope for establishing a list of forests and vulnerable system preservation goods, essentially, and find ways to provide potentially preferential market access for those goods. That's not in there yet, but there is a provision that says that they'll be developing a list like that shortly, so or within a year. So that would be also, again, incentivizing positively ways in which to create market access for sustainably produced forest products. And then finally, there is a funding pledge of 1.8 billion to facilitate, a number of different things, including, and this is part of the Global Gateway, including the development of new sustainable forest value chains, etc. So that's also interesting. It's not in the agreement because legally that's not possible. It's outside the agreement, but there is that commitment that recognizes that funding is going to be required. So I'm going to stop here and turn it back to Claudia.
Thanks a lot, Colette. It was a great overview into like the evolution that basically the EUDR took into these discussions, right? Because the EUDR goes from being an irritant in the negotiations, slowing down progress and basically arising tensions between the EU and Mercosur, to being somehow, it could be seen as an incentive, right? Like now producer countries in the EU have somehow an incentive to engage in the EU in bilateral trade agreements that could be seen as a platform for regulatory cooperation. For instance, so there was quite of an evolution in terms of approaches in this regard. But now maybe before I turn back to my own little analysis on the next steps at the EU level, I think it might make sense to go back to you, Geraldo, because at the same time that the EU-Mercosur agreement is being used as an informal platform, not informal in a sense, but like the EUDR is not really mentioned in the agreement, as Colette said, but as a way to facilitate regulatory cooperation, there are also some concerns in the EU that, for instance, the rebalancing mechanism could be seen as a way to exempt the EU-Mercosur countries from these requirements that other producing countries will have to comply with. There's a lot of uncertainty as to what this rebalancing mechanism will mean in practice. So it'd be great to hear from you. What are your thoughts on this? You're muted, Geraldo. Sorry.
Yes. Thank you. No, this is really interesting. So I think the main provision that has been causing some issues is paragraph 55, and I have in front of me of the new annex, and it says, and I'll just quote the provision first. Sorry for the lawyerly intervention. Where a party's law provides for verification of compliance of an imported product with the relevant laws of another party, the parties acknowledge that the authorities of the party are the best placed to assess compliance with the law of that party. Hence, when assessing compliance with the law of a party, the parties shall use the information provided by the lettered authorities. Now, this is, of course, a heavily negotiated text between the parties. And it has been, let's say, it does provide, let's say, some assurance to Mercosur countries that the EUDR, which is the provision that is, let's say, as Colette said, refers to, let's say, everybody knows, but it's not stated here because the EUDR, one of the requirements is that the products are produced lawfully under the law of the country of production, right? So in the sense of, and with respecting their environmental rules. And it is an issue that, I imagine that many countries are like this, and I'm aware that Brazil is like this, that the law on the books is often different from the law. Let's say there's depending exactly also on finance, and for a variety of reasons, there's often a significant gap between the law on the books and the actual compliance. And that's what both the EUDR provision and this one is trying to get at, right? So they say that the products have to comply. The EU is going to essentially act as an enforcer for the domestic environmental laws of the country of production. And of course, if the agreement then states that, for example, all countries shall comply with their own laws and regulations, which sounds like let's say a self-evident provision in some ways. Of course, if then this can be enforced via the EUDR, requiring that this compliance be proven in order for products to be exported to the EU, then we're looking at a far more constraining arrangement, even if the provision itself is not enforceable through the mechanism that we are used to think of as being enforcement. Now, what does this provision require, right? I mean, let me just be lawyerly about this. It says that the parties, so let's say the EU in one case, shall use the information provided by the other parties' authorities when assessing compliance with the law of that party. First of all, I think this sounds like it's only reasonable, right? So that you can use that the information. Let's say that the parties, I think that say that the premise is correct, that the parties' authorities are best placed to provide information on law compliance. But let's say the paragraph 55, this provision, doesn't say that the EU has to agree with the authorities, right? It doesn't say that the decisions of domestic authorities are determinative. It only says that the EU has to use the information provided by the parties' authorities. So if you wanted to look into this with a magnifying lens, you would think that the EU can say, well, we've used 20 sources of information, one of which, in compliance with paragraph 55, is the assessment of domestic authorities, and we have concluded that in this particular case, the assessment of domestic authorities doesn't prevail. I think that sounds like something possible. So I think the issue here is that, I mean, everybody who asked me this is asked me about who won, who is going to have the absolute right, and of course that's not how certainly treaties work. There's a saying that we say that treaties are disagreements reduced to writing. So in a way, the question is, have Mercosur countries ensured that they have a certain leeway and won't be completely ignored by the EU in making decisions, assuming, of course, that all of this enters into force. As we know, this is becoming more complicated by the day. But at the same time, the EU has the right to, it seems to me that this provision at least doesn't require the EU to agree with whatever the authorities say. If the authorities of a country were to, let's say, go rogue and simply start, rubber stamping everything as compliant with domestic law, I don't think paragraph 55 prevents the EU from, even applied strictly, prevents the EU from saying, in this particular case, we have used the information provided by the authority, and we have used other information, and this other information seems to be more reliable. And that's it. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Geraldo. So maybe in the interest of time, we can move into the practicalities of next steps. So as it was mentioned several times already, both parties have reached a political agreement in December, but these by no means mean that the agreement is completed and ratified, at least not on the EU side. But then what can we expect in the coming months on the EU side? So as of now, there has been a political agreement. The text has been published by both parties, and the text is undergoing what we call in EU jargon legal scrubbing. And once this legal revision is done, then the text will be translated into the EU's official languages, and the Commission will submit a proposal to the Council for signature and conclusion. After that, the agreement will have to be submitted to the Parliament for ratification. So this is basically, in short, the formal process. Now, in practice, it will be a bit more challenging than this, because we can expect a Commission proposal by mid-2025, so around June, July. It depends on how long the legal scrubbing takes and the translation, but this is kind of the estimates as of now. And this Commission proposal will spell out the legal basis that will determine the future of the agreement. And I don't want to get into too much into the nitty-gritty of the legal discussion, especially because I think there are other people in the panel probably better placed to do that than me. But I just would like to highlight the practical implications that the legal basis picked by the Commission will have in terms of process. Because as of now, the Commission website refers to the EU-Mercosur partnership agreement. So the legal basis is a bit unknown, whether it's an association agreement, a free trade agreement. And there are a few scenarios. So basically, as Geraldo mentioned already, the EU-Mercosur agreement is an association agreement, is a fairly big and comprehensive agreement that has 3 pillars. It has a trade component, a political dialogue, and a cooperation pillar. And in this current stage, this agreement is what is called in EU jargon a mixed agreement, because it has provisions of the exclusive competence of the EU, such as trade, and has provisions on competences that are shared between the EU and its member states. So if the Commission proposal submits this agreement as a mixed agreement to the Council, practically speaking, it would mean that it would be quite hard to get it concluded, because in terms of majorities in the Council, it would require unanimity. And on top of that, it would require full ratification. So European Parliament consent and ratification by the member states following their national procedures. So it would be quite lengthy and complex. And on top of that, it would require that all member states are on board, which is not by any means the case at the moment. I will get there later on into which member states are on board or not. But as of now, like for instance, France and Poland have voiced their concerns already. Now, the most likely scenario is that the Commission will split the agreement to facilitate the trade part of the agreement to get into force, because this has quite some implication when it comes to the majority. So if the Commission splits the agreement into a trade part and a political and cooperation part, which has been done in the past versus in the case of the EU-Chile agreement, what will happen is that the trade component will be proposed to the Council and will only require qualified majority, which means that will have to be approved by 15 of the 27 member states in the EU, representing at least 65% of the EU's population. So when it comes to a blocking majority, in order for the Council to be able to block this agreement, there will have to be at least 4 countries against the agreement, representing 35% of the population of the EU. As I said, this has been done in the past, for instance, in the case of the EU-Chile agreement, which has basically been split into 2 parts. The trade part has already been approved and will be, but it's basically what it's called an interim agreement. So it will be in place until the bigger agreement is ratified by the member states, in which case then only this comprehensive framework will be in force. Now, what is the likelihood of this agreement, even if it's split and submit to the Council, to be approved? Well, as I said, it would only require qualified majority, but there are still some member states against the deal. As of now, it's not very clear which member states would vote in favor and against for sure, as not all member states have taken a public stance on it. And also the position of member states have evolved since since 2019 due to many of the factors that was already mentioned earlier. But some of the countries that we do know that will vote against the agreement are France and Poland, namely because of the pressure that the agreement will put into their farmers. And other countries that have been traditionally against the deal are Netherlands and Ireland. It's for instance, the Netherlands has not yet expressed a clear rejection of the deal recently, but based on its historical position, it's expected to vote against. Probably Austria as well, Luxembourg. But at this stage, even if these 4 member states, be it France, Poland, Ireland, and the Netherlands, vote against, they would not represent 35% of the population. It would be roughly around 29. So there will be no blocking majority. Again, it's a bit hard to predict how this will evolve. I think in this equation, like the position of big member states like Italy will be quite important, as they represent like roughly 14% of the EU population. But while Italy has, in some instances, Meloni has expressed concerns of the impact of the deal on EU farmers, it hasn't really come with an official position yet. On the other hand, we have some members that are in favor. So for instance, Germany and Spain are leading a coalition of member states in favor of the deal. And among other things, they cite the need to find new export markets, which is getting more and more important, especially after the Trump elections and the tariff threats that are materializing quite quickly. And on the other hand, on the need to reduce dependency from China. So they see this as an opportunity for the EU to find new alliances and find new export markets. And then, of course, all of the member states' own interests come into play, right? So Germany has an interest in exporting cars and chemicals, pharmaceuticals, and other things. While, for instance, member states like Spain have also some interests, notably in agricultural exports that normally are cited as a reason to be against the deal. But in the case of Spain, they see an added value in exporting high added value olive oil, for instance. So it's a bit hard to predict. What we see is a bit of an evolution of positions in a way that in 2019, there were more voices against this deal. And in the new political context, the positions have shifted a bit because this deal is seen as quite important in a new geopolitical context. But then even if the agreement passes the council, then it will have to be submitted to the parliament for consent. So it's basically a yes or no. The parliament either accepts or rejects the proposal. It cannot really amend it at this stage. And in the parliament, it's quite interesting because the parliament is not really divided between party lines necessarily. I mean, some groups in the European Parliament are against the deal, such as the Greens, but generally speaking, the parliament seems to be divided more into country lines. So France tends to be against within the EPP, which is the conservative party in the European Parliament and the biggest party, political group as well. You can find people who are against the deal because it will hurt EU farmers, and people who will be in favor of the deal because they focus on the need to find new export markets. So it's a bit hard to predict also in the Parliament how this will go in practice. But in the Parliament, we see even more this shift. First, because after the European elections, there are more conservative voices in the Parliament, which tend to be less green. The Green Deal is no longer at the center of the EU political agenda. There have been calls for simplification, to water down in some cases EU regulations. There is a renewed focus on the need to sign free trade agreements. And while in the previous mandate, as Geraldo also briefly mentioned, there was the Trade and Sustainable Development Review, which seek to include all of these sustainability assurances in FTAs, and they were seen by the majority in the parliament as non-negotiable and something that needed to make it into all new agreements. Now the sustainability considerations are a bit left out, at least for the majority. Of course, there are still some voices in the parliament that are very much opposed to the deal. At the same time, the deal still faces some opposition by agricultural groups and consumer organizations and environmental groups. I won't go much into detail into all of these concerns, but as Geraldo mentioned, there are some concerns that on the one hand, for instance, many farmers worry that the deal will threaten their livelihoods, particularly in sectors like beef, which might struggle to compete with more competitive imports coming from the Mercosur. There are also concerns that there are differing food safety and quality standards between the products produced in the EU and those imported into the EU coming from the EU-Mercosur, and that will put basically EU farmers at a disadvantage, as well as putting consumers at risk. There are concerns into the fact that there are insufficient controls at the border, so even the EU regulations, food safety regulations that exist, wouldn't be able to be checked as often as they should. And last but not least, there are still concerns regarding to the environmental impact of the agreement as a potential source of deforestation in the Amazon. Due to expanding agricultural expansion linked to cattle, for instance, and soy production. There's just one last type of concern that is not mentioned as often, that has to do with the overall process, not so much to do with the content of the agreement and the implications for farmers and the environment, but also regarding how the negotiations took place. So several people point out to the fact that, for instance, the first text, in the first text that was agreed in 2019, negotiations were concluded before the sustainability impact assessment was completed. There were disagreements about the continuation of the deal. Instead of reopening the text, the Commission decided to amend and add an annex, rather than opening the text and going through the full democratic procedure from the start. And then there is one last concern that has to do with the opacity of the negotiations in 2023 and 24, where basically member states and the European Parliament mainly and some stakeholders were not really given regular updates. And as Geraldo mentioned as well, we were given updates through the media. So one last point from my side before I give the floor to Rodrigo is what happens if the deal is not ratified this time, at least on the EU side. Well, I guess one of the options would be to go back to the negotiating table, but I don't think there is a lot of political appetite to do this at this point, especially if we consider that the negotiations have been ongoing for over 20 years, almost 25 years now. So I don't think there is a political appetite to go back to the negotiating table and restart this whole process. Another alternative would be to engage with Mercosur countries on a bilateral basis through more targeted deals. So for instance, the EU already has a strategic partnership on raw materials with Argentina, and it could do something similar with Brazil, for instance, using the new model that has been announced by the new Commission, the so-called clean trade and investment partnerships. There are expected to be smaller, more targeted trade partnerships or agreements, depending on the legal nature, with a more targeted scope. So I will leave it at that, and maybe I'll give the floor to Rodrigo, because it's enough to talk about the EU, and maybe now it would be good to hear what is the state of play in the Mercosur.
Well, thank you so much, Cláudia. Thank you so much, Colette and Geraldo, for the explanations. So in terms of the initial deal that was preliminary agreed on in 2019, there has been a bunch of changes. Geraldo and Colette and Cláudia also, they underscored some of those changes. In Brazil, it is usual by the Brazilian government at least, to call a set of concessions that have been given by the European Union as the Brasilia package. So basically, this Brasilia package has a few important points. These points, they're not in the same level of importance, however. Okay, so I believe that the first and foremost, what is most relevant in order for this deal to get to an agreement after 2019 was the rebalancing mechanism. So it is very unclear what this is going to be, in fact. So Geraldo can talk more about that, and Cláudia and Colette as well, but this rebalancing mechanism seems to be kind of, I haven't seen that before in many cases. And this opens many fronts for questioning, both from Brazil and other Mercosur countries and from the European Union. What is the evidence that you have to show that there is nullification? So you have some cases in the GATT, in the General Trade Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, that used the argument of nullification to complain against other parties. And generally, the idea is that the evidentiary threshold, well, and I'm not a lawyer, so I'm sorry for overstepping, but as far as I understood, the evidentiary threshold is very difficult to meet. So what does that actually mean to have a nullification? When do you prove that? And that's something that a negotiator from the European Union told me that that's going to be there, but we do not really know how it's going to play out. Then there is Articles 55 to 57, which Colette very clearly mentioned, which basically recognizes the role of Mercosur in offering information to the European Union that the European Union has to consider when, for instance, creating risk levels related to UDR. As Geraldo correctly pointed out, it's not like the European Union has to use it, it has to consider it. It may or may not agree with it. But then a question that I have to Geraldo is it possible in the future, and here we are just talking about possibilities and everything's possible, I guess, is it possible that if the European Union does not use, or if Brazil claims that the European Union, or Mercosur claims that the European Union is not using Mercosur information, can Brazil kind of say or have more evidence that there is kind of some sort of nullification in case they want to plead in favor of that? And then there is the government procurement sector clauses. Brazil had a huge discussion internally about government procurement, and at the end of the day, we left aside government procurement related to our health system, our public health system, SUS, Sistema Único de Saúde. So no contractors from the European Union to anything related to public health in Brazil. This to me seems like the three biggest concessions that Brazil needed in order to go further. There are, of course, other elements in there. The Paris Agreement, Brazil wanted to kind of clarify whether Paris Agreement would be subject to sanctions. The additional protocol that the European Union had beforehand kind of gave the impression to some Brazilian officials that not meeting the Paris Agreement could be subject to sanctions. So the European Union tried to take that out and put as an essential element, but did not talk anything about sanctions specifically. But then there is another question, which is essential elements. Labor has been an essential element for quite a long time, if I'm not mistaken, in European Union trade and sustainable development chapters. And no specific measure has been. So what? Okay, sorry. But then we do not know, nothing specific came out of that, right? And then my colleagues can complement me on that. And then there are a bunch of other concessions that Brazil required, Mercosur required, such as certain limits on the exports of critical materials on Brazil's side, and a different tariff elimination schedule on Brazil's side, especially for automotive products. Okay, Brazil's industrial policy nowadays seems to be kind of focused, especially as far as this specific agreement goes. Brazil seems to be putting its coins on protecting its industrial policy by means of protecting or giving a little bit more protection to the automotive sector, also as a mechanism to try to promote green transition as far as electric automobiles go. So what lies ahead from the perspective of Mercosur? So it doesn't seem to me that the source of discontent is going to come to Mercosur in any meaningful way. Even if we have all the discussion about Milei leaving Mercosur, negotiating with the United States, so there's a bunch of considerations to be made about that. First of all, Milei considers that the Mercosur is a constraint on Argentina. And Milei is certainly unpredictable in a way, but, well, it doesn't mean that he's not pragmatic, also because usually, even these people that they seem quite unpredictable, when they take the office, they start having to take some pragmatic decisions. Otherwise, they're going to face some political costs. Well, Argentina is also uses or can also use Mercosur as a bargaining chip vis-a-vis Brazil. So it doesn't seem to me very pragmatic to necessarily leave Mercosur in a moment in which you want to show that you're able to strike deals, in a moment that Milei wants to be considered, Argentina to be considered a developed country. Okay, and Milei, after all, he wants trade agreements. He says that he wants trade agreements, and that's an ideological aspect of his discourse. So it doesn't seem to me that him as the president of Mercosur is going to pose any meaningful threat to this agreement going forward. Paraguay and Uruguay, they don't seem to be posing, as far as my knowledge go, so much concern. In terms of Brazil's reaction to it, the Brazilian Congress is certainly not going to reject this agreement. There is no precedent in Brazilian Congress rejecting a trade agreement, also because there are very few. We don't have so many trade agreements. But let's say that, well, it's a new trade agreement. UDR is kind of making producers a little bit concerned. Well, it seems to me that the concessions that have been offered to the agriculture sector in Brazil regarding unilateral measures from the European Union, as vague as they may be, are going to be more than enough. It is important to remember as well that the Brazilian agricultural sector is competitive regardless. It's very big producers, and these big producers, the Bancada Ruralista in Brazil, which is the rural coalition in the Brazilian Congress, takes up to 60% of the seats, okay? So it is unlikely for us to have some sort of meaningful position from Brazil. And well, this is recorded, so I hope that in 3 years' time, I'm not going to see myself back and see that I was completely wrong. But I don't see many difficulties coming from Brazil. Now, I would like to just very quickly, before I give the word to Cláudia, I would like to pose a question also to Colette and perhaps to Geraldo, but I think that mainly to Cláudia. In terms of the prospects for this agreement to go forward, especially in the European Union, in political science, we usually measure whether an agreement is going to have discontent if it deviates too much from its existing templates. So if you take a look at trade agreements from the European Union and the US, they usually follow a very clear template. The template changes, and it's very difficult to backslide. Sometimes you have some backsliding, and that generates costs, and then the next trade agreement tries to kind of add something to the previous one. This trade agreement seems to be bringing many things new in relation to existing TSD templates in the European Union. So that does create the concern for me as to whether this is a very context-dependent trade agreement, in the sense that it is only going to go forward if we have a war in Ukraine and if we have a short supply of critical materials, and if we have unpredictable people in power in main countries such as the United States. That's it. I'll move it back. I'll give it back to Claudia. Thank you.
I don't know if any of you wants to answer this question. Otherwise, I can also have a first go. But go ahead, Colette.
If I may, Claudia, I just wanted to maybe directly respond to that question and perhaps a handful of other things that Rodrigo mentioned, if that's okay, briefly. No, I'm really glad, Rodrigo, that you provided the regional perspective on this, because that's always really, really important when you have these discussions. And your references to the essential element clause, I think, are really interesting, because that is essentially the limitations of it, right? I mean, the essential element clause, it's connected to also what Geraldo mentioned, right? The Trade and Sustainable Development chapter review, where the EU said we want to have the Paris Agreement as an essential element in all of our free trade agreements going forward, because we consider, climate change such an overarching important value or issue that we believe in. Now, interestingly, and I think you mentioned this as well here in EU-Mercosur, the essential element clause isn't quite as extensive as the essential element clause in, say, EU-New Zealand or the EU-UK, because it only looks at the only element that's the essential element is exiting essentially the Paris Agreement, right? Whereas in the other agreements, it's more broadly defined that the essential element is basically complying with climate change and the fight against climate change, and any serious or substantial failure to do so is considered a violation, right? So I think that's an interesting difference, and that probably reflects some of the difficulties in the negotiation. But even so, and some are saying exactly that, President Milai's threat to exit the Paris Agreement might be impacted by then the potential of having the EU suspend or terminate in part Mercosur vis-a-vis Argentina, right? Because it's not with the whole Mercosur bloc. But I think you're absolutely right to point out that the geopolitical interests of the different parties, right? And not only on the Mercosur side and on ratifying this agreement for the different Mercosur countries, but also for the EU, right? Because if indeed after 20 odd years this agreement is now concluded finally and say it's been ratified, will the EU have enough political will to say, like hypothetically say Milei gets out of this agreement, to then in fact actually follow up on suspend or terminate in part that the Mercosur. So I think that is a really valid question to ask, and I wanted to just kind of highlight it a bit from the EU side as well, and maybe perhaps on the the essential element clause history. The Cotonou agreement has one, the one with the ACP countries, not so much on labor, but on respect for human rights and democratic principles of law, because for the EU it was always kind of the highest principles that they deemed really essential, that they couldn't compromise on that, right? But labor as such, I haven't seen that being covered, but I do know that the Convention on Biological Diversity has been referenced as potentially another candidate to make into an essential element of any future FTAs, but with a shift of the Commission's direction a bit here away from, say, the Green Deal. I'm not sure what the appetite is there, but that could be interesting also from a deforestation perspective. Then in terms of, if I may, and I don't want to take away Geraldo's question, but if I may add 2 cents from me on your question, Rodrigo, about what would happen if, in terms of Article 55, if Mercosur were to say, well, you haven't actually used the information provided by us in assessing compliance, right, with some of the regulations. I think it's a great question because it exactly captures some of the weaknesses of this annex, right? Because the term is use, right? I think if indeed the Mercosur countries have this, if this were to happen, and you would challenge the EU under the special, TSD dispute settlement, which is not a sanctions-based dispute settlement, but you would bring this up, I think it would still be rather easy for the EU to say that it's been used, depending on however you define use, right? So it's the weakness in which the provision is framed that would make it have little teeth if you actually were to pick this up, at least legally. Politically, it might actually have a little bit more force, but that's another element. And Geraldo, please add to that, as you wish. But then just now, ending with your final question about the template, right? Which I think is also a really relevant question. Like you have these new practices that then become the new best practice, and it's really hard to kind of deviate from that going forward, right? And so your question being, well, this was quite specific as to how we got here. How will that then be relevant going forward for the EU? Now, what I found really interesting is that a lot of the trading partners, and not just say Malaysia or Mexico, but also the Philippines, for example, that are negotiating these FTAs with the EU, or India for that matter, they are very carefully looking at EU-Mercosur, and especially in the trade and sustainable development chapter, because they're saying, their question is always, and I work with quite a few of these countries, have Mercosur countries gained an advantage in complying with these unilateral regulations over what we're getting, right? And if so, we want to get that same thing, right? So that's been the question that I've heard from so many different negotiators, and they're all very carefully looking at this. So I think that the EU, is going to be pressured very much in using this, at least in what's there in terms of the interaction with the unilateral measures, and providing something like that as well in its agreements with ongoing emerging markets and its negotiations. I think they're going to be hard pressed to include something like that as well. So that might become somewhat of a new model, but because it's in a bilateral context, there's of course always some leeway to make it more specifically aligned to the interests of the country involved. So we might see some more sui generis elements added there, but I think it's definitely a direction where the EU has at least paved that way, and it's going to be very difficult for them, I think, to now detract from that because other countries want the same treatment. So I'm gonna stop here and turn over the floor back to Cláudia and Geraldo, possibly.
Maybe I'll give just a chance of Geraldo to react if he wishes to.
Yeah, for sure. I don't want to take time away from our audience who may want to ask questions. So I think to 2 points, right? So first of all, one of these agreements, as any agreements, they can be seen from 2 different perspectives. And I'm sorry for the light now because our building in Amsterdam is not prepared for the sun shining. So So one is, the sort of signaling exercise, right? So what are you agreeing on, and what is being decided? Let's say what does the text suggest, right? And then therefore, we see that if a text says that the Paris Agreement is an essential element of the agreement, that's let's say that's represent a shift, as Rodrigo was saying, from there being no such reference, or if he says, the parties affirm their adherence to the Convention on Biological Diversity. It's a sort of, let's say, I don't want to use the term vibes-based governance, but that's it. It's just, you mention something and therefore it becomes part of the conversation, and it becomes an element that could influence even a judicial decision, right? I mean, we've seen that even the preamble, things that normally we don't pay that much attention to, can be crucial in determining interpretation. The other thing besides this, what are we writing down is what does the agreement empower different parties to do, and what is the allocation of power. Now, of course, if you're talking about a domestic contract that can be enforced via the judiciary, the distribution of power is very important, right? It's, when I began my career as a corporate lawyer for a very short time, environmentalists, don't blame me. But then, that was a very important thing, right? If you write in a contract that the party has has the power to, let's say, file a meeting of the parties and change the articles of association unilaterally, that in case something happens, that's a very big power. And if that party has to obtain the judicial decision in order to do that, that means 3-4 years. Maybe it makes this alleged power useless. So if we're thinking just in terms of attribution of power, weirdly enough, adding these procedures is detracting power from the parties, right? Because under public international law, if you didn't have any of the institutional provisions, the parties could just self-interpret the agreement and act accordingly. So that you could just decide, well, you haven't complied with this, and therefore we're responding that way. But of course, that's not how international relations happens usually, especially among allies. Is that you're not just deciding things unilaterally and responding unless that you've gone to a more aggressive relationship if you're doing that. So it's important to have this body that's going to interpret. And at the same time, and I'll get to the point in a second, this body that gets to interpret often will have to interpret these ambiguous provisions. So one of the things that what again Rodrigo asked, what about what is the evidence here? I think the main question that will be asked when it comes to this second possibility under the dispute settlement chapter of bringing cases of non-violation, right, to do this rebalancing mechanism, is what is the threshold here? Because in a way, any regulation can be seen as harming trade, right? If you discover tomorrow that blue ink from a pen is toxic, and then you prohibit that in your territory, if there's an exporter on the other side, even if the product is toxic, you could think of that as a form of trade barrier. Now, we've gone past this conversation in trade law about 20 years ago, and of course, under Article 20 of the GATT, the WTO jurisprudence has concluded that if it's non-discriminatory and if you're not aiming at producing a barrier to trade, it is not what is the Article 20 of the GATT calls a disguised restriction on trade, then it's allowed, even if you are restricting trade. And even if it just so happens that the blue ink that the other party makes is affected and yours is not, right? Provided that you have a legitimate regulatory distinction to back up that. Now, for this provision, it would suggest that it's something more than that, right? So even if you did that, and if it produced a substantive impact on the other party, it would require you to provide some form of compensation. At the same time, it's unlikely, let's say, that I think that if something is, let's say, let's say, find that it's cancer-inducing, that the party that an arbitrator will consider that this is a provision that violates this, that reaches the level of threshold necessary. So there will be some sort of intent-based, or at least, which is something that normally trade adjudicators have steered away from, decision on whether this is a measure that aims to produce certain effects on the other party. Now, this doesn't say that, the provision doesn't say it, and I wouldn't, let's say, I haven't seen any jurisprudence on this, so it's hard to know how it would be interpreted. But the parties would have to see whether, what kind of measure would be would reach the threshold where some rebalancing is required. Okay, all of that said, I don't expect this provision to be used very heavily, to be honest. I think I think it's a means for the parties, again, to go back to my the first function, right? Instead of assigning powers and obligations, to just provide to just offer the parties a means of negotiations. I think that the let's say other provisions, such as the one that requires the use of domestic authorities assessments, provide a clearer obligation. And this one, it just gives you an instrument to say, if you're taking something meaningful from me with your new regulation, and then you must provide me with an instrument to rebalance this relationship. Again, it's even difficult for us now to know exactly where this will go, but this is the essential idea behind the provision.
Thanks a lot, Geraldo. If I may just comment on what Rodrigo said, or rather answer his question. I can see that we have 2 questions in the chat box, but I will be very brief because I found it quite interesting that what Rodrigo said about the fact that the EU is deviating from its template with the EU-Mercosur, because indeed, like we see like some provisions on regulatory cooperation when it comes to deforestation. We see some the rebalancing mechanism that, as it's been highlighted in this discussion, is not really clear what will mean in practice, and to a certain extent, it seems to have been interpreted differently by the Mercosur, which seems to believe that it could use as a way to get compensation from the impact that the EUDR has on the balance of the agreement. And on the EU side, the EU has been very vocal, saying that in no way this will jeopardize the EUDR implementation. So all of these are indeed new features, and like countries like Malaysia and probably Indonesia and many other trading partners are looking at this carefully, because the concerns of the EU-Mercosur of the Mercosur were also concerns of other trading partners, right? But I find it quite interesting that you said that this is like moving away from the traditional approach, because the way I saw it was moving away from an approach of the trade and sustainable development review of the EU that introduced all of these stronger sustainability focus, that in reality, it could be argued that it didn't really work out in practice, right? Because what we have seen is that ever since the EU adopted this new approach, only the EU-New Zealand agreement fully incorporated. We've seen a decline of the EU FTAs in the previous EU cycle, and of course, this is not to say that it's all due to the requirements that the EU was asking, the commitments, the sustainability commitments that the EU was asking from its partners in the bilateral negotiations. Of course, it has to do also with the unilateral agenda. But the way I see this evolution now in the new text of the EU-Mercosur is that it was the EU's response to the new geopolitical environment, because it needed the deal, but also in a way that it was to address the concerns of the partners, that they were like, you're asking me on the one hand more sustainability commitments, but on the other hand, you're putting barriers through your unilateral regulations. So I see it as a natural evolution and a departure from a more strict approach that didn't really bear a lot of fruits. But maybe now I can go back to the chat box, because I see 2 questions. So the first one is from Tiago Almeida. Actually, both of them are from Tiago Almeida. My first question is to Colette. The critical raw materials are essential to the EU to have access to those, particularly in the global south. These regulations are different from the EUDR, which focuses on goods, particularly regarding goods target like soybeans and all. Is there a double treatment of EU policies, the CRM on the one hand and the EUDR on the other hand? And the second question to Geraldo, considering that the EUDR is a unilateral instrument by the EU, why not including a new model of the EUDR inside of the EU-Mercosur agreement, giving a multilateral consensus in this regulation? It's quite an interesting question, right? Because the EU decided to move ahead with unilateral agenda while negotiating FTAs. But I mean, indeed, ideally, in the ideal world, this would be achieved on a bilateral basis, I guess. At least it could be argued this way. But maybe I can give the floor to either Colette or Geraldo, as you wish. Maybe Geraldo.
No, let's just Colette to start.
Go ahead, Colette.
I thought it was a nice segue for your question, Geraldo, but I'll start. The question on raw materials. So yeah, no, I mean, I'm guessing you're getting at something quite important. Is there a way in which perhaps the commodities covered by the EUDR are treated through a different standard or a different lens than, say, critical raw materials that the EU really needs to achieve its net zero commitments as well as remain competitive, right? And it's an interesting way of looking at this, because if you look at, say, the Critical Raw Materials Act, right, which governs access to critical raw materials, the objective is very much accessing those materials, right, with an eye towards the importance of those materials for the EU's climate objectives and all. On the EUDR side, the objective is very much to make market access conditional on stringent deforestation and legality requirements. So they are quite different. And I think that difference is reflected in the fact that it is so critical for the EU, for lack of a better word, to access these critical raw materials, right? So it's almost as if the EU is saying, we really need access to those raw materials, and we are not therefore going to add binding market access conditionalities on sustainable mining in order to get those materials, right? Because then the EU will not get them, right? Because then the countries mining those materials, they're going to get much better offers without strings attached from China and from other the US and other bigger markets. So that will make it very difficult for the EU to then achieve its geopolitical interests and its climate agenda as well as its competitiveness. So I think that is in part why we do see a little bit of a different treatment. You see that very clearly, I think, when you're looking at the way in which back to EU FTAs, in which FTAs cover or include provisions on critical raw materials access versus on sustainability. So we've looked a little bit, of course, in the seminar on TSD chapters, but the regular TSD chapters in a lot of EU FTAs, you know, without all the innovations, basically are quite hortatory, best endeavor, and they have high-level references to sustainability. But then, if you compare that to the chapters on energy and raw materials, there are binding and they are very specific requirements on mostly producer countries on what they need to do to provide market access to, say, EU investors, etc. Right? So it's about, say, a prohibition on dual pricing, a prohibition on monopolies, a prohibition on export restrictions. So you do see when you compare how clear and legally binding and an obligation it sets out in terms of what needs to happen to access the materials, and on the other hand, how weak some of the sustainability provisions are, you do see, I think, a little bit of a hierarchy. And I would venture to say that when it comes down to sustainable or critical raw materials, sustainability concerns do take a second seat. And so there is room here for the EU to better align its agenda internally, right? To make sure that sustainability and deforestation issues aren't relevant just for the handful of agricultural commodities covered by the EUDR, but go beyond, because actually failure to adopt a more comprehensive approach could actually lead to perverse incentives. So you can imagine a situation where you know, you have a plot of land that you can either use to cultivate cocoa or coffee, or you can mine. Now, cocoa and coffee is subject to the regulation, the EUDR. Mining is not, right? So could the fact that, say, mining is excluded lead to an increase in mining activities and thereby in deforestation relevant to mining? So those are questions that I think are still very relevant and that haven't been sufficiently explored, but that we should keep in mind as we deal with, you know, how to align everything, and especially as the EU is now kind of pivoting a little bit, right, away from the Green Deal towards the clean industrial deal, where it's really recognizing it's the importance of prioritizing competitiveness and national security, etc., and climate, as opposed to perhaps sustainability driving the bus. So I think those are some open questions we have that we all need to keep thinking about.
I don't know if perhaps Geraldo wants to come in, or Rodrigo.
Yeah, so I'll go to the other question. I guess the question is, so, you know, why not have a specific mechanism in the agreement that replaces the EUDR, because it's unilateral? I mean, in a way, all trade policy is unilateral, right? Or let's say, I mean, if like Brazil earlier this year prohibited the importation of waste into Brazil. That's also a unilateral policy. Presumably, if there was an EU company selling waste to Brazil, which let's assume there was, because I think that's quite likely, then this company can no longer export the waste to Brazil. Now, again, what is the discussion we're having here, right? So, I mean, this is, let's say, the issue that the WTO has, I think, largely correctly addressed, which is how do you decide whether this is legitimate and therefore lawful or not? And the answer is that if it's non-discriminatory and if it addresses a real problem, and in this case, of course, if you think about it, it's about importation, so it's by design discriminatory. But the discrimination is designed to fulfill a legitimate objective, that is stopping your country from becoming a dumping ground for waste from other countries. And therefore, this is Brazil tires, the WTO case 2008. This is allowed. Now, how would this fare under this idea? So the agreement would also have to have a specific rule for waste because Brazil came up. This cannot work otherwise. This agreement becomes, and they are becoming, trade agreements are already becoming a sort of, I call them the mobile phones of agreements. So they just sort of everything gets incorporated into these agreements. But there's for what the EU is trying to do, I think, and I was trying not to get too academic here, but there's a mismatch, right, between a world economy that operates transnationally and the lack of a world legislature. So this is what has to be negotiated. So how do everybody recognizes that, or let's say everybody, it's too many people, but there are vast documents conveying international consensus that things like deforestation are bad, and that we have to reduce carbon emissions as a species to preserve not the planet, because the planet will be here after we're gone, but our own lifestyles and survivability. But of course, who gets to decide how this is going to happen, and who has to act first, and who has to pay the costs? That is what is being negotiated. And what you're the political scientist, Rodrigo, but we have a clear collective action problem here, which is that the risk is that if you don't allow anyone to act, let's say decisively, then nobody does anything, and then we get to an unsustainable planet. On the other hand, the system has to preserve the right of the right of individual parties to have their own policies and not be governed by others. So all the trade agreements do, and all the in this setting, what's the function of trade agreements? To try to find fragile compromises between various parties that don't make this into an either-or situation. So either the EU gets to dictate what everybody else does, or each country can do whatever it wants, which is likely to lead to a race to the bottom in terms of environmental protection. And so this is, there is no ultimate solution to this, right? We'll have to always have this conversation and have renegotiations about this. So that's why having this. You could add this in an agreement, but then, and now the last thing I'll say on this. We get to Colette's scenario, right? So if Brazil gets or let's say Mercosur countries in general get a special treatment because of a trade agreement, well, it could be a good thing, because it would lead. If you think that trade agreements that have some environmental clauses are better than no environmental clauses, but it will also lead to other kinds of complaints. And you could think of a complaint even at the WTO, right? So why does Brazil get to have the special treatment under the EUDR? Because it has a trade agreement. And again, this is Brazil tires, 2008 body report. You can draw a distinction between countries, because depending on how they produce and how products are produced, and even sometimes depending on national regulations, a little more contentiously. But you cannot draw a distinction between. If you have a measure that is aiming at a legitimate objective, let's say deforestation, you can't really draw distinction between countries on the basis of whether they are your friend countries or not, or the basis of whether you have a trade agreement with them or not. So the EU is trying to walk on thin legal ground here. And I think let's say it's doing it. Let's see whether this agreement, as Cláudia pointed out, is going anywhere in the first place. But again, it's a step into a broader conversation that has to happen. But at the same time, I don't think that there's a right answer for every one of these things. I will have to figure out how much of the work or cleaning up production has to be done by whom. And also in a way that preserves everybody's right to have regulatory sovereignty. Thank you.
And I'm mindful of the time, but we still have like 2 minutes left. Thanks a lot, and Geraldo, and thanks a lot. Colette, maybe Rodrigo, if you want to say some last words, otherwise I think we're very close to the end.
Yeah, just very quickly, I agree with Geraldo, and I think that including a model of EUDR inside of the deal, well, of course, that when we think about this mechanism of rebalancing, we think about EUDR, but Brazil is not just thinking about EUDR. Brazil is thinking about unilateral measures by the European Union in general. So Brazil wants to create. Well, the negotiators in Brazil, they are smart, right? So they know that we are in a context of unilateral policies and that Brazil has very little market power to actually say, I'm going to impose a tariff on the European Union, and the European Union is going to be like, yeah, so what? But if the European Union wants to impose a tariff on Brazil, then it's going to create a huge problem for us, right? The same for the US. So I don't think Brazil is thinking only about EUDR. It's going much beyond. And there is one element here, which is evidence that unilateral policies are very much politically feasible at home. Right. So if you ask to people that we have all the discussion about collective action, right? So and Geraldo is right. We always modeled climate action as a collective action problem, meaning that if my partner does not do something, I'm not going to do something. I'm not going to be paying the costs. However, evidence shows that unilateral policies are feasible politically at home as far as mass politics goes. Public opinion, even if other countries are not doing the same thing. So unilateral policies are very feasible at home, and they're going to be an instrument of thinking politically, and perhaps even too much politically, an instrument of governance from now on, even more than it has been in the past. And we also found that even when you promise that you're going to set a tariff on China, and then you back down, which would generate in political science what we call audience costs, meaning that, well, you promised to tax China and now you're not taxing them. The fear of retaliation from China justifies EU backing down. So in a way, unilateral trade policy is politically feasible at home. It is not so politically feasible abroad, but then the issue goes back to what Geraldo said. It doesn't matter because trade policy is unilateral. If Brazil wants to put a tariff in all other countries that export whatever to Brazil, it can do so because it's not discriminatory as long as it does it to everyone else, right? So I think that the Brazil's mind is not just focused on UDR, it's focused on unilateral policies in marginally.
Thank you. I guess unless anyone has anything else to say, I think this is quite a nice way of ending the discussion. We have touched upon the text, upon the geopolitical context, upon next steps. So I think it was a quite comprehensive and very interesting discussion. So I just would like to thank the speakers, but also everyone who joined this discussion. And that's it. Thank you very much, and see you next time, I guess.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for attending. Thank you.
Thanks for sharing, Cláudia.
I'm stopping the recording.